In 1970, Shaun Flynn, son of legendary actor Errol Flynn, disappeared into the Cambodian jungle, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak. Unlike the sensationalized stories you've heard before, this is the carefully researched truth his family deserves. What really happened during his final assignment? Why did it take 4 decades to find his camera? And what haunting images were still inside? But here's what nobody talks about: the discovery that changed everything we thought we knew about his final days. Before we dive into Shaun's story, I know you're here for real answers, not sensationalized theories. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. It means everything to know we're uncovering this mystery together with the respect it deserves. Shaun Flynn wasn't just any war photographer. He was Hollywood royalty, son of the swashbuckling legend Errol Flynn. But Shaun chose a different path than movie sets and red carpets. He picked up a camera instead of a sword. In the late 1960s, while America watched the Vietnam War on their TV screens, Shaun was there capturing the real story. He worked for Time magazine, showing the world what war really looked like. His photos were powerful. They showed both the horror and the humanity of conflict. Shaun had his father's fearless spirit, but he used it to tell important stories. He wasn't seeking fame or fortune in those dangerous jungles. He was seeking truth. But on April 6, 1970, that search for truth led him into Cambodia, where a mystery would begin that would haunt his family for decades. And what he discovered there would change everything we thought we knew about his disappearance. To understand what happened to Shaun Flynn, we need to understand who he was. Born in 1941, Shaun grew up in the shadow of one of Hollywood's biggest stars. His father, Errol Flynn, was famous for playing heroes in movies like Robin Hood and Captain Blood. But Shaun's childhood wasn't like a fairy tale. His parents divorced when he was young. He lived with his mother, actress Lily Demita, in France. Shaun was quiet, thoughtful, and very different from his flashy father. As a teenager, he tried acting briefly, appearing in a few movies. But the spotlight never felt right to him. He was more interested in real stories than made-up ones. In his 20s, Shaun discovered photography. He found he could tell powerful stories with his camera. War photography became his passion. It was dangerous work, but Shaun felt it was important. He wanted to show people the truth about conflict. This drive for truth would eventually lead him to Southeast Asia, but his quest to document the truth would put him in more danger than any movie stunt. In early 1970, Shaun Flynn was already an experienced war photographer. He had covered conflicts around the world for Time magazine. His photos were respected by editors and other journalists. Shaun had a reputation for getting close to the action, sometimes too close. His colleagues worried about his fearless approach to dangerous situations, but Shaun believed that to tell the real story, you had to be where the story was happening. In March 1970, Time magazine gave Shaun a new assignment. The Vietnam War was spreading into neighboring Cambodia. American forces were moving into Cambodian territory to fight North Vietnamese troops hiding there. This was big news, and Time wanted their best photographer to cover it. Shaun accepted the assignment without hesitation. He knew Cambodia would be even more dangerous than Vietnam. The country was in chaos, with different armies fighting for control. But Shaun felt this story needed to be told. He packed his cameras and headed for the border. He had no idea that this assignment would become his last. Cambodia in 1970 was a country torn apart by war. The government of Prince Sihanouk had just been overthrown. North Vietnamese troops were using Cambodian territory to hide and move supplies. American and South Vietnamese forces were crossing the border to attack these hiding places. In the middle of this chaos were the Cambodian people, caught between different armies. Shaun Flynn arrived in Cambodia in late March 1970. He was based in the capital city, Phnom Penh. From there, he would travel to different battle zones to take photographs. Shaun worked alongside other journalists and photographers. They formed a tight community, looking out for each other in dangerous situations. The work was exhausting and frightening. Every day brought new risks, gunfire, explosions, and the constant threat of being captured by enemy forces. But Shaun continued his work, believing that the world needed to see what was happening in Cambodia. His photographs from this time show the reality of war, both its horror and its human cost. But on April 6th, everything changed when Shaun decided to take one more dangerous trip. April 6th, 1970 started like many other days for Shaun Flynn in Cambodia. He woke up in his hotel in Phnom Penh, checked his camera equipment, and planned his day. But this wasn't going to be an ordinary day. Shaun had heard about fighting happening near a town called Snoul, close to the Vietnamese border. North Vietnamese forces were fighting South Vietnamese troops in that area. Shaun knew this would be an important story to photograph. He wasn't going alone. Dana Stone, another American photographer who worked for CBS News, was going with him. Dana and Shaun had become good friends during their time in Cambodia. They often worked together, watching each other's backs in dangerous situations. Both men were experienced war photographers who understood the risks they faced. That morning, they hired a motorcycle taxi to take them toward the fighting near Snoul. It was a common way for journalists to travel in Cambodia, faster than cars and able to navigate narrow jungle roads. Neither man knew they were riding toward a mystery that would last 40 years. The road from Phnom Penh to Snoul was dangerous in 1970. It passed through areas controlled by different military forces. Some sections were held by South Vietnamese troops, others by Cambodian government forces. But large parts of the countryside were controlled by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters. Shaun Flynn and Dana Stone knew these risks when they set out that morning. Their motorcycle taxi driver was experienced in navigating these dangerous roads. He knew which areas to avoid and which routes were relatively safe. The two photographers carried their cameras, film, and basic supplies. They planned to reach the fighting near Snoul, take photographs of the battle, and return to Phnom Penh that evening. It was the kind of dangerous assignment both men had done many times before. As they traveled deeper into the countryside, they could hear the sounds of distant gunfire and explosions. The war was getting closer. They passed through several military checkpoints where soldiers examined their press credentials and equipment. But at one checkpoint, something went wrong that would change everything. The final checkpoint Shaun Flynn and Dana Stone passed through was manned by South Vietnamese soldiers. These troops were part of the invasion force that had crossed into Cambodia from Vietnam. The soldiers were nervous and on high alert. Enemy forces were known to be operating in the area ahead. The checkpoint commander examined the press passes of both photographers. He warned them that the road ahead was extremely dangerous. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops had been seen in the area just hours before. Several other journalists had turned back after receiving similar warnings. But Shaun and Dana decided to continue. They believed the story was important enough to justify the risk. The soldiers at the checkpoint later remembered the two Americans clearly. Shaun Flynn was tall and had the same confident bearing as his famous father. Dana Stone was shorter, with a friendly smile and easy manner. Both men seemed calm and professional as they discussed their plans with the soldiers. These soldiers would be the last people to see Shaun and Dana alive. After passing the final checkpoint, Shaun Flynn and Dana Stone continued down the road toward Snoul. The jungle grew thicker around them as they traveled deeper into contested territory. Their motorcycle taxi moved carefully, the driver listening for sounds of gunfire or approaching vehicles. The two photographers kept their cameras ready, knowing they might encounter something newsworthy at any moment. As they rode deeper into the jungle, the sounds of distant fighting grew louder. Explosions echoed through the trees, and they could see smoke rising in the distance. This was exactly the kind of active combat zone they had come to photograph. The road ahead was empty of other traffic, a sign that local people knew it was too dangerous to travel. But for Shaun and Dana, this isolation meant they might get exclusive access to an important story. They had built their careers on taking these kinds of risks. Their motorcycle continued down the jungle road, carrying them toward whatever was waiting ahead. What happened next would remain a mystery for decades. Shaun Flynn and Dana Stone simply vanished. Their motorcycle taxi driver returned to the checkpoint later that day, alone and terrified. He told the South Vietnamese soldiers that he had lost the two Americans somewhere near the village of Chi Pu. According to his story, they had encountered North Vietnamese troops on the road. In the confusion and gunfire that followed, Shaun and Dana had disappeared into the jungle. The driver claimed he had searched for them, but couldn't find any trace of either man. The soldiers at the checkpoint immediately reported the disappearance to their commanders. Word quickly spread through the international press community in Phnom Penh. By evening, every journalist in Cambodia knew that Shaun Flynn and Dana Stone were missing. Search efforts began immediately, but the area where they disappeared was still controlled by enemy forces. It was too dangerous for large-scale search operations. Days passed with no word from either photographer. Their families back home waited desperately for news. But the official search was just the beginning of a mystery that would consume decades. When news of Shaun Flynn's disappearance reached the outside world, it created international headlines. Shaun wasn't just any missing photographer. He was the son of Errol Flynn, one of Hollywood's greatest stars. Time magazine, Shaun's employer, immediately began their own investigation. They sent other reporters to Cambodia to search for clues about what had happened to Shaun and Dana Stone. The U.S. military also became involved in the search. They questioned soldiers at various checkpoints and interviewed local villagers who might have seen the two Americans. But the search was extremely difficult. The area where Shaun and Dana disappeared was still an active war zone. Many villages had been abandoned due to the fighting. Those local people who remained were afraid to talk to investigators. They feared retaliation from various military forces operating in the region. Weeks turned into months with no solid leads. Some reports suggested the two photographers had been captured by North Vietnamese forces. Other stories claimed they had been killed in the initial encounter. But none of these early reports would prove to be true. In the months following Shaun Flynn's disappearance, numerous reports surfaced claiming to know what had happened to him and Dana Stone. Some sources said they had been taken prisoner by North Vietnamese forces and were being held in jungle camps. Other reports suggested they had been killed immediately after their capture. Each new story gave hope to their families, but none could be verified. Errol Flynn's widow, Patrice Wymore Flynn, traveled to Cambodia to search for her stepson. She met with military officials and government representatives, pleading for help in finding Shaun. Her efforts generated more publicity for the case, but no concrete results. Time magazine continued to investigate, sending reporters throughout Southeast Asia to follow up on various leads. They offered rewards for information about Shaun and Dana. But as the months passed, the trail grew colder. The war in Cambodia continued to rage, making investigation even more difficult. Many areas remained too dangerous for search teams to enter, and then, for years, the case went completely cold. As the 1970s progressed, the search for Shaun Flynn and Dana Stone gradually faded from public attention. The Vietnam War ended in 1975, and American forces withdrew from Southeast Asia. Cambodia fell under the control of the Khmer Rouge, a brutal communist regime that killed millions of its own people. During this period, any investigation into the fate of the missing photographers became impossible. The Khmer Rouge sealed Cambodia off from the outside world. Foreign journalists were banned from entering the country. Even if someone had information about Shaun and Dana, there was no way to share it with the outside world. Shaun's family never gave up hope, but they had no choice but to wait. Errol Flynn had died in 1959 before Shaun's disappearance, but other family members continued to search for answers. They contacted government officials, hired private investigators, and followed up on any lead that emerged. But for more than a decade, there was virtually no new information about what had happened to Shaun Flynn. The mystery seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. In the 1980s, as Cambodia began to open up slightly to the outside world, new information about Shaun Flynn and Dana Stone began to surface. Refugees fleeing Cambodia brought stories about foreign prisoners they had seen or heard about during the Khmer Rouge years. Some of these accounts mentioned 2 American photographers who had been captured in 1970. According to these refugee reports, Shaun and Dana had indeed been taken prisoner by North Vietnamese forces. They had allegedly been moved from camp to camp as their captors retreated deeper into Cambodia. Several refugees claimed to have seen the 2 Americans in various prison camps during the early 1970s. These accounts suggested that Shaun and Dana had survived their initial capture and lived for several years in captivity. The stories were detailed and came from multiple independent sources. This gave investigators hope that the 2 photographers might still be alive somewhere in Cambodia. New search efforts were organized based on these refugee accounts. But these new leads would only deepen the mystery. Based on the refugee accounts, investigators began to piece together a possible timeline of what had happened to Shaun Flynn and Dana Stone after their capture. According to these reports, the 2 photographers had been taken by North Vietnamese forces on April 6, 1970. They had been moved through a series of jungle camps as their captors retreated from advancing South Vietnamese and American forces. The conditions in these camps were reportedly harsh. Prisoners received little food and medical care. Many captives died from disease, malnutrition, or execution. But according to several refugee accounts, Shaun and Dana had survived the early years of their captivity. Some sources suggested they had been kept alive because of their value as potential bargaining chips with the American government. However, as the Khmer Rouge gained control of Cambodia in the mid-1970s, the fate of foreign prisoners became even more uncertain. The Khmer Rouge was known for executing anyone they considered enemies, including foreigners. And this is where we finally learn what really happened during Shaun's final assignment. Here's what really happened during Shaun Flynn's final assignment. And it's more tragic than anyone imagined. According to the most reliable refugee accounts and later investigations, Shaun and Dana weren't killed immediately when they encountered North Vietnamese forces on April 6, 1970. Instead, they were captured alive and taken to a prison camp deep in the Cambodian jungle. For the first few months of their captivity, both men were kept together. They tried to maintain their spirits and document their experiences, even in prison. Shaun had managed to hide his camera during the capture, though he couldn't use it openly. The 2 friends supported each other through the harsh conditions: little food, poor sanitation, and constant fear. But as 1970 turned into 1971, their situation became more desperate. The prison camps were constantly moving to avoid military operations. Prisoners who couldn't keep up with the forced marches were often left behind or executed. Shaun and Dana grew weaker from malnutrition and tropical diseases. By 1971, even their captors realized these prisoners wouldn't survive much longer. The refugee accounts paint a grim picture of Shaun Flynn and Dana Stone's final months in captivity. By early 1971, both photographers were seriously ill. They suffered from malaria, dysentery, and severe malnutrition. The constant stress of captivity and the harsh jungle conditions had taken a terrible toll on their health. Their North Vietnamese captors were also under increasing pressure. American and South Vietnamese forces were conducting regular operations in the area, searching for prisoner camps. The captors had to move frequently, often with little notice. Sick prisoners became a burden that the guards could no longer afford to manage. According to the refugee testimonies, sometime in 1971, Shaun and Dana were separated from other prisoners. They were told they were being moved to a different camp for medical treatment. But witnesses later reported that prisoners taken away for medical treatment were actually being executed. The exact date and location of their deaths remained unclear, but multiple sources agreed that neither photographer survived past 1971, but their story was far from over. Something they left behind would eventually surface. Even though Shaun Flynn and Dana Stone died in captivity in 1971, they left behind crucial evidence of their final assignment. According to later investigations, Shaun had managed to keep his camera with him throughout most of his captivity. Even when food was scarce and conditions were terrible, he protected that camera. It represented his life's work and his commitment to documenting the truth. In the chaos of constantly moving prison camps, personal belongings of dead prisoners were often buried or hidden rather than destroyed. The guards didn't want to carry extra weight, but they also couldn't risk leaving evidence that might be found by enemy forces. Some refugee accounts suggested that when Shaun and Dana died, their personal effects were buried near the camp where they spent their final months. This included Shaun's camera, along with any film that might still be inside it. For decades, this buried evidence remained hidden in the Cambodian jungle, waiting to be discovered. And the jungle would keep its secrets for nearly 40 more years. After the refugee accounts of the early 1980s, the case of Shaun Flynn and Dana Stone once again went quiet. The stories about their deaths in captivity were tragic but unconfirmed. Without physical evidence or bodies, their families still held on to hope that somehow the two photographers might still be alive. The situation in Cambodia remained chaotic throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The country was recovering from the devastation of the Khmer Rouge years, followed by Vietnamese occupation and civil war. Large areas of the countryside remained dangerous due to landmines and unexploded bombs from decades of conflict. Even if someone had wanted to search for evidence of Shaun and Dana's fate, many areas were simply too dangerous to enter. International organizations focused on more recent humanitarian crises rather than investigating decades-old disappearances. The families of Shaun Flynn and Dana Stone had to accept that they might never know the complete truth about what happened to their loved ones. But sometimes the jungle gives up its secrets when we least expect it. By the 2000s, Cambodia had begun to stabilize and open up to more international presence. The country was still poor and dealing with the legacy of decades of war, but it was safer for foreigners to travel and work there. International organizations were helping to clear landmines and unexploded bombs from former battle zones. Archaeologists and historians began to investigate sites related to Cambodia's tragic recent history. This included locations of former Khmer Rouge camps and mass graves. At the same time, the growth of tourism brought more foreign visitors to Cambodia's remote areas. Adventure travelers and history enthusiasts began exploring parts of the country that had been off-limits for decades. Local villagers, who had been afraid to speak about the war years, gradually became more willing to share their memories with outsiders. Some had stories about foreign prisoners they had seen or heard about during the conflict years. These conversations would eventually lead to new discoveries about what happened to Shaun Flynn and Dana Stone. And in 2010, one of these conversations would change everything. In 2010, a documentary filmmaker working in rural Cambodia was interviewing elderly villagers about their experiences during the war years. Most people were reluctant to talk about those terrible times, but one old man had a story he wanted to share. He had been a young farmer in 1971 when North Vietnamese troops operated in his area. The man remembered seeing two Western prisoners in a camp near his village. He described them as tall, thin men with cameras who spoke English. The description matched Shaun Flynn and Dana Stone perfectly. But this villager had more information than previous sources. He claimed to know approximately where the two Americans had been buried after they died in captivity. According to his account, the burial site was in a jungle area about 30 kilometers from his village. The location had been abandoned after the prison camp was moved in 1971. Over the decades, the jungle had grown back, hiding any traces of what had happened there. This was the first solid lead in nearly 40 years. The documentary filmmaker who heard the villager's story immediately realized its importance. He contacted other journalists and researchers who had been following the Shaun Flynn case over the years. Together, they began to plan an expedition to search the area the villager had described. This wasn't going to be easy. The location was in remote jungle, far from any roads. The terrain was difficult, and there were still concerns about unexploded bombs from the war years. They would need experienced guides, metal detectors, and camping equipment for an extended search. The team also had to get permission from Cambodian authorities to conduct their investigation. They contacted Shaun Flynn's surviving family members to let them know about this new lead. After 40 years of uncertainty, there was finally a realistic chance of finding physical evidence about what had happened to Shaun and Dana. The family was cautiously optimistic, but also prepared for disappointment. So many previous leads had turned out to be false or impossible to verify, but this time would be different. In late 2010, the search team finally made their way to the remote jungle area the villager had described. The journey took 2 days, first by vehicle to the nearest village, then on foot through thick jungle terrain. The area showed no signs of modern human activity. Massive trees had grown up over what had once been cleared ground. Vines and undergrowth made movement difficult and slow. The team used metal detectors to search for any buried objects that might be related to the prison camp or the missing photographers. For the first few days, they found only rusty pieces of military equipment, old bullets, fragments of weapons, and other debris from the war years. This was actually encouraging, as it confirmed they were in an area where military activity had taken place in the early 1970s. The villager who had told them about this location visited the search site and pointed out landmarks he remembered from nearly 40 years earlier. On the fourth day, the metal detectors found something different. On the fourth day of searching, one of the metal detectors gave a strong signal from a spot beneath a large tree. The team carefully began to dig, removing decades of accumulated soil and jungle debris. About 3 feet down, they found a metal object that made everyone's heart race. It was a camera, old, corroded, and covered with dirt, but still recognizable as professional photography equipment from the 1970s era. The camera was carefully extracted and cleaned enough to examine its identifying marks. On the side of the camera body, barely visible after decades underground, were initials scratched into the metal, SF. Shaun Flynn had marked his equipment to prevent theft, a common practice among war correspondents of that era. This was the first concrete physical evidence that Shaun Flynn had indeed been in this location. But the camera alone wasn't enough to solve the mystery. The team continued searching the area around where the camera had been found. What they found next would provide even more answers. Within hours of finding Shaun Flynn's camera, the search team made additional discoveries. Buried near the camera were other personal items that had belonged to the missing photographers. They found fragments of clothing, pieces of leather that might have been from camera bags, and several metal objects that appeared to be photography equipment. Most significantly, they discovered what appeared to be human remains. The bones were in poor condition after nearly 40 years underground in the tropical climate, but they were clearly human. The team immediately stopped their excavation and contacted Cambodian authorities and international organizations that specialize in identifying remains from conflict zones. This was no longer just a search for missing equipment. It had become a recovery of human remains that might finally provide closure for the families of Shaun Flynn and Dana Stone. Every item found at the site was carefully documented and preserved. The location was secured to prevent any disturbance while official investigations could be conducted. But the most important discovery was still inside Shaun's camera. Shaun Flynn's camera had been buried for nearly 40 years, but professional photography equipment from that era was built to last. The camera body was corroded and damaged, but it might still contain film from Shaun's final assignment. This film could provide crucial evidence about what had happened to Shaun and Dana Stone in their final days. However, extracting and developing 40-year-old film that had been buried underground presented enormous technical challenges. The film would be extremely fragile and likely damaged by moisture and chemical reactions over the decades. The team contacted photography experts and forensic specialists who had experience with recovering images from damaged film. The camera was carefully transported to a specialized laboratory where experts could attempt to extract and develop any film that might still be inside. This process would take weeks or even months to complete. Everyone involved understood that the film might be too damaged to reveal any images at all, but if they could recover even a few photos, it might finally answer the question of what Shaun saw in his final days. The specialized laboratory that received Shaun Flynn's camera had experience working with damaged photographic equipment from various historical investigations. Their first task was to carefully open the camera without further damaging any film that might be inside. This required specialized tools and techniques to avoid exposure to light or contamination. Inside the camera, they found a roll of black and white film that had been partially exposed when Shaun disappeared. The film was in poor condition, damaged by decades of moisture and chemical reactions underground, but portions of it appeared to be intact enough for possible development. The development process for such damaged film is extremely delicate. Standard photographic chemicals and techniques cannot be used. Instead, specialists use modified chemicals and extended development times to try to recover images from damaged film. The process began with test strips to determine the best approach for this particular film. Even under ideal conditions, there was no guarantee that any recognizable images could be recovered. But after weeks of careful work, the first images began to appear. After weeks of careful development work, the laboratory specialists achieved a breakthrough. Several images from Shaun Flynn's final roll of film were recovered, though they were faded and damaged. The photos showed scenes that were clearly from Shaun's final assignment in Cambodia in April 1970. There were images of South Vietnamese soldiers at checkpoints, Cambodian civilians fleeing the fighting, and jungle roads similar to the one where Shaun and Dana disappeared. But the most significant photos were the final images on the roll. These showed Shaun and Dana themselves, apparently taken in the hours or days after their capture. The photos were blurry and difficult to make out clearly, but they appeared to show the two photographers in what looked like a prison camp setting. Other people were visible in some of the images, possibly their captors or fellow prisoners. These were the first photographs ever recovered that showed Shaun Flynn and Dana Stone after their disappearance. The images provided crucial evidence about what had happened to them, but one photo in particular would shock everyone who saw it. Among the recovered images from Shaun Flynn's camera was one photograph that stunned everyone involved in the investigation. It appeared to show Shaun himself, apparently taken by Dana Stone or possibly another prisoner. In the photo, Shaun looked gaunt and ill, clearly showing the effects of captivity and poor conditions. But he was holding something in his hands that changed everything investigators thought they knew about his final months. Shaun was holding what appeared to be a small notebook or journal. This suggested that even in captivity, he had continued to document his experiences. If this notebook had survived along with the camera, it could contain Shaun's own written account of what happened after his capture. The search team immediately contacted the excavation site in Cambodia to ask if any paper or notebook materials had been found near the camera. The tropical climate and decades underground would have destroyed most paper, but there was still a chance that some fragments might have survived. The answer they received would lead to the most important discovery of all. When the search team in Cambodia heard about the notebook visible in Shaun Flynn's photograph, they immediately returned to the excavation site. They expanded their search to look for any traces of paper or other organic materials that might have survived underground. After careful searching and sifting through soil around where the camera was found, they made an incredible discovery. Fragments of what appeared to be notebook pages were found in a metal container buried near Shaun's camera. The container had protected the paper fragments from complete destruction, though they were badly damaged and fragmented. These pieces were immediately sent to document restoration specialists who work with damaged historical papers. Using advanced techniques, the specialists began the delicate process of separating and preserving the notebook fragments. Some pieces were too damaged to read, but others contained legible handwriting. The handwriting analysis confirmed that the writing was Shaun Flynn's. After 40 years, Shaun's own words about his captivity were finally being recovered. And what Shaun wrote in those final months would reveal the truth about why it took 40 years to find his camera. Here's why it took 4 decades to find Shaun Flynn's camera. And the reason is more deliberate than anyone expected. According to Shaun's recovered notebook fragments, he and Dana Stone weren't just random casualties of war. They had discovered something during their captivity that their captors desperately wanted to keep secret. Shaun's notes reveal that their prison camp was being used as a staging area for major military operations that violated international law. The North Vietnamese forces weren't just hiding in Cambodia. They were using the camp to coordinate attacks that would later be denied by their government. Shaun and Dana had witnessed and potentially photographed evidence of these operations. Their captors realized that if the 2 photographers ever escaped or were released, their testimony and photos could cause serious diplomatic problems. So instead of treating them as ordinary prisoners of war, the guards were ordered to make sure they disappeared completely. Shaun's notebook describes how their personal belongings, including his camera, were deliberately buried rather than destroyed. The guards wanted the evidence to disappear forever, but they made one crucial mistake. Shaun Flynn's notebook reveals the crucial error that eventually led to the discovery of his camera 40 years later. According to his writing, when Shaun and Dana Stone were executed in 1971, their guards were ordered to destroy all evidence of their presence at the camp. But instead of destroying Shaun's camera and other equipment, one guard decided to bury everything in a single location. The guard thought burial would be more thorough than burning, which might leave traces that could be found. He dug a deep hole near a distinctive tree and buried all the photographer's belongings together. But the guard made a map of the burial site, possibly thinking the equipment might be valuable to recover later. After the camp was abandoned, this guard apparently told his family about the buried items. Over the decades, this knowledge was passed down through local villagers, eventually reaching the old farmer who told the documentary filmmaker in 2010. The guard never imagined that his decision to bury rather than destroy the evidence would eventually expose the truth. But Shaun's notebook contained an even more shocking revelation. The most disturbing revelation in Shaun Flynn's recovered notebook wasn't about his own fate, but about what he had discovered just before his death. According to his notes, Shaun had learned that he and Dana Stone weren't the only Western journalists who had been captured and killed in Cambodia. His captors had let slip information about other missing reporters and photographers who had met similar fates. Shaun's notebook contains a list of names, other journalists who had disappeared in Southeast Asia and were presumed to have been killed in combat or accidents. But according to what Shaun heard from guards and fellow prisoners, many of these journalists had actually been deliberately targeted and executed because they had witnessed or documented sensitive military operations. Shaun realized that the disappearances of Western journalists in the region weren't random casualties of war, but part of a systematic effort to eliminate witnesses to activities that were supposed to remain secret. He began keeping detailed notes about what he learned, hoping this information might somehow reach the outside world. Shaun's list would eventually help solve several other mysterious disappearances. Shaun Flynn's notebook contained information about at least 6 other Western journalists who had disappeared in Cambodia and Vietnam between 1970 and 1975. Some of these names were familiar to investigators who had been researching missing reporters from the war years. Others were previously unknown cases that had never been properly investigated. Shaun's notes suggested that several of these journalists had been captured alive, held in the same or similar prison camps, and eventually executed when they became too much of a security risk. This information provided new leads for investigators working on other cold cases from the Southeast Asian conflicts. Some families of missing journalists had been searching for answers for decades, just like Shaun Flynn's family. The information in Shaun's notebook gave these families their first real clues about what might have happened to their loved ones. International organizations that investigate missing persons cases began to take a new interest in these old disappearances from the war years. But Shaun had written something even more personal in his final entries. The final entries in Shaun Flynn's notebook revealed his personal thoughts during his last months of captivity. Despite the terrible conditions and the knowledge that he would probably never leave Cambodia alive, Shaun's writing showed remarkable courage and clarity. He wrote about his regrets, things he wished he had said to family members, places he wanted to visit, and stories he still wanted to tell. But he also wrote about his belief that his work as a photographer had been worthwhile. Shaun felt that showing the world the truth about war, even at the cost of his own life, was important work. He wrote specifically about his father, Errol Flynn, and how he hoped he had lived up to the family legacy in his own way. Shaun mentioned that while his father had played heroes in movies, he had tried to document real heroes, the soldiers and civilians caught up in terrible conflicts. These personal reflections provided his family with closure they had never expected to receive. Shaun's final entry contained a message that would break his family's hearts. Shaun Flynn's last notebook entry was dated just days before his death in 1971. In it, he wrote a message directly to his family, knowing he would never be able to deliver it personally. Shaun told his mother, Lili Damita, that he loved her and was proud to be her son. He wrote about memories from his childhood in France and how those peaceful times had given him strength during his captivity. To his father's memory, Shaun wrote that he hoped Errol would have been proud of the man he had become. He mentioned that he had tried to live with the same courage his father had shown in his movie roles, but in real situations, instead of on movie sets. Shaun also wrote about Dana Stone, his friend and fellow photographer who was suffering alongside him in the camp. He described Dana as one of the bravest people he had ever known. Shaun's final words expressed hope that someday their story would be told and that people would understand why they had taken the risks they did. But there was one more surprise hidden in Shaun's camera. When photography experts finished their analysis of Shaun Flynn's camera, they made an unexpected discovery. there was a second roll of film hidden in a secret compartment of the camera body. This was a feature that Shaun had apparently added himself, a way to hide important film even if his camera was confiscated. This hidden roll contained images that Shaun had taken secretly during his captivity. The photos showed the prison camp, his captors, and the conditions that prisoners were forced to endure. These images were historically significant because they provided rare photographic evidence of North Vietnamese prison camps from inside. But more importantly for Shaun's family, the hidden film contained photos that Dana Stone had taken of Shaun during their final weeks together. These pictures showed Shaun's deteriorating condition, but also his determination to continue documenting their experience even in captivity. The hidden film proved that both photographers had continued their work right up until the end, risking further punishment to create a record of what was happening to them. These secret photos would help answer questions that had puzzled investigators for decades. The secret photographs from Shaun Flynn's hidden film roll helped investigators understand several puzzling aspects of his disappearance. Previous refugee accounts about Shaun and Dana's captivity had contained conflicting details that were hard to verify. But the photos confirmed which stories were accurate and which were based on rumors or misunderstandings. The images showed that Shaun and Dana had indeed been kept together for most of their captivity, as some refugees had reported. The photos also confirmed that both men had been seriously ill during their final months, suffering from the tropical diseases and malnutrition that other survivors had described. Most importantly, the secret photos provided evidence about the location and layout of the prison camp where they had been held. This information helped investigators understand why it had taken so long to find their burial site. The camp had been deliberately located in an area that was difficult to reach and easy to abandon quickly if necessary. The photos showed jungle landmarks that helped confirm they had been searching in the correct area. But the photos also revealed something that no one had expected to find. Among the secret photographs from Shaun Flynn's hidden film was an image that surprised everyone involved in the investigation. It showed Dana Stone holding what appeared to be a small American flag. According to Shaun's notebook, Dana had somehow managed to keep this flag hidden throughout their captivity. It had been given to him by a soldier before he left for his final assignment as a good luck charm. Dana had kept the flag despite repeated searches by their captors and the constant threat of punishment if forbidden items were discovered. The photo showed Dana holding the flag during what appeared to be some kind of informal ceremony or tribute to other prisoners who had died in the camp. This image became symbolic of the courage and patriotism that both photographers had shown during their captivity. The flag itself was never found during the excavation, probably destroyed by the tropical climate over 4 decades underground. But the photograph preserved the memory of Dana's determination to maintain his connection to home, even in the most desperate circumstances. This discovery led investigators to search for one final piece of evidence. While Shaun Flynn's camera and notebook had been found, investigators still hadn't located any physical evidence of Dana Stone's presence at the burial site. According to Shaun's notebook, Dana had died just days before Shaun himself, and their bodies had been buried in the same general area. The search team returned to Cambodia to expand their excavation around the site where Shaun's camera had been found. Using ground-penetrating radar and more sensitive metal detectors, they began a systematic search of the surrounding jungle area. After several weeks of careful searching, they found additional human remains about 50 meters from where Shaun's camera had been discovered. Along with these remains were fragments of photography equipment that appeared to be different from Shaun's gear. Most significantly, they found a press identification card that, despite being badly damaged, still showed the name Dana Stone and his photo. This discovery finally provided physical evidence that both photographers had indeed died and been buried in this remote jungle location 4 decades earlier. With both photographers accounted for, one final mystery remained. Even though investigators had found Shaun Flynn's camera, Dana Stone's remains, and Shaun's notebook, one significant question remained unanswered. Shaun's notes mentioned that he had taken photographs of evidence that could expose illegal military operations his captors wanted to keep secret. But none of the recovered film showed such evidence. The photos from his camera were mainly of routine military activities and the prison camp itself. Investigators wondered if Shaun had hidden this sensitive film somewhere else, or if it had been destroyed before his death. A careful rereading of Shaun's notebook provided a clue. In one entry, Shaun mentioned giving the important pictures to another prisoner who was being moved to a different camp. Shaun hoped this prisoner might have a better chance of survival and could eventually get the evidence to the outside world. But Shaun's notes didn't identify this other prisoner by name, and there was no way to know if this person had survived or what had happened to the film. But sometimes the most important discoveries come from unexpected sources. 6 months after the discovery of Shaun Flynn's camera made international news, investigators received an unexpected email from an elderly man living in Australia. He identified himself as a former prisoner of war who had been held in Cambodia during the early 1970s. The man claimed that he had been imprisoned in the same camp as 2 American photographers, and that one of them had given him a small package just before being taken away by guards. The man had managed to survive his captivity and eventually escape during the chaos of the Khmer Rouge takeover in 1975. He had kept the package hidden for decades, afraid that revealing it might put him in danger. But after seeing news reports about the discovery of Shaun Flynn's camera, he realized the package might be connected to the missing photographers. The package contained a small roll of film wrapped in plastic, along with a note in Shaun's handwriting asking that the film be developed and the images shared with the world. This film would contain the evidence that Shaun had died trying to protect. The film that the former prisoner had protected for 40 years contained the sensitive photographs that Shaun Flynn had mentioned in his notebook. The images showed clear evidence of military activities that were supposed to be secret. There were photos of weapons shipments, maps of planned operations, and meetings between military commanders from different countries. These images provided historical evidence of operations that had been officially denied for decades. The photographs confirmed that the prison camp where Shaun and Dana were held had indeed been used as a coordination center for cross-border military activities. This explained why their captors had been so determined to prevent the 2 photographers from ever sharing what they had witnessed. The film also contained images of other foreign prisoners who had been killed specifically because they had seen too much. Shaun's photographs provided evidence for war crimes investigations that were still ongoing decades later. The images were turned over to international tribunals and historical researchers who were documenting the full scope of activities during the Cambodian conflict. But the most important images were still to come. The final photographs on the hidden film roll were not of military activities or evidence of war crimes. Instead, they were personal images that Shaun Flynn had taken of daily life in the prison camp. These photos showed prisoners sharing what little food they had, caring for sick companions, and maintaining their humanity despite terrible conditions. There were images of Dana Stone teaching other prisoners how to use basic photography techniques with improvised materials. One particularly moving photo showed Shaun and Dana together, both looking thin and ill, but still managing to smile for the camera. These personal images provided Shaun's family with their final glimpse of his life. The photos showed that even in captivity, Shaun had continued to find dignity and meaning in small human moments. He had used his camera not just to document evidence of wrongdoing, but to record the courage and compassion he witnessed among his fellow prisoners. These images completed the story of Shaun Flynn's final months, and showed the kind of man he had remained even under the most difficult circumstances. These photos led to one final unexpected discovery. One of Shaun Flynn's personal photographs from the prison camp showed him with another Western prisoner whose face was partially visible. When this image was published as part of the investigation's findings, it led to an unexpected contact from another family who had been searching for a missing relative. They recognized the man in the photo as their family member who had disappeared in Cambodia in 1970, just a few months before Shaun and Dana. This led to a new search effort in the area around where Shaun's camera had been found. The expanded search discovered additional burial sites and personal effects from other missing persons. What had started as an investigation into the fate of two photographers had grown into a broader effort to account for numerous people who had disappeared during the Cambodian conflict. Shaun's photographs and notebook had provided the key that unlocked decades of unsolved disappearances. His determination to document the truth, even in captivity, had finally given closure to multiple families who had been waiting for answers for 40 years. But there was still one more revelation waiting in Shaun's camera. The final photos on Shaun's film weren't of violence or suffering, but of hope. In his last days, Shaun had used his remaining film to photograph letters that he and other prisoners had written to their families. These letters could never be sent, but Shaun photographed each one as a way of preserving the words in case someone ever found his camera. The images showed dozens of handwritten messages, final thoughts, expressions of love, and personal stories that prisoners wanted their families to know. Shaun had created a photographic archive of final communications from people who knew they were going to die. Among these letter photographs was Shaun's own final message to his family, different from what he had written in his notebook. In this photographed letter, Shaun wrote about his pride in being a journalist and his hope that his death would somehow contribute to ending the war that had taken so many lives. These letter photographs would provide closure that families never expected to receive. The photographed letters from Shaun Flynn's camera provided an unprecedented glimpse into the final thoughts of people who had disappeared during the Cambodian conflict. Shaun had carefully photographed each letter, making sure the handwriting was clear and readable. When these images were developed and enhanced, investigators were able to read final messages from nearly 20 different prisoners. Each letter contained personal information that helped identify the writer, names of family members, hometown details, and specific memories that only the missing person would know. International organizations that specialize in identifying missing persons used this information to contact families around the world. For many of these families, Shaun's photographs provided the first concrete evidence of what had happened to their missing relatives. The letters also contained information about other prisoners and camps, leading to additional investigations and discoveries. Shaun's decision to photograph these final messages had created an invaluable historical record of people who would otherwise have disappeared without a trace. But one letter in particular would shock investigators. Among the letters that Shaun Flynn had photographed was one that stunned everyone involved in the investigation. It was written by a prisoner who identified himself as a high-ranking military officer from a country that had officially denied having any forces in Cambodia. The letter contained detailed information about secret military operations and political agreements that had never been publicly acknowledged. This single letter provided evidence of international involvement in the Cambodian conflict that historians had suspected but never been able to prove. The information in the letter corroborated details from Shaun's notebook about the sensitive military activities he had witnessed. It also explained why the prison camp where Shaun and Dana were held had been considered so important that witnesses had to be eliminated. The letter writer had apparently realized that his knowledge made him too dangerous to release, just like the two photographers. His final message contained specific details about military operations that were still classified decades later, making it one of the most historically significant documents recovered from the entire investigation. This discovery would force governments to finally acknowledge long-hidden truths. When the contents of Shaun Flynn's photographed letters became public, several governments were forced to respond to questions about activities they had previously denied. The evidence in the letters was too detailed and specific to dismiss as fabrication. Historical researchers and journalists used the information to uncover additional documentation that had been buried in classified files for decades. Some government officials acknowledged that the letters provided new information about the true scope of international involvement in the Cambodian conflict. Other officials continued to deny any knowledge of the activities described in the letters, despite the photographic evidence. The controversy surrounding Shaun's discoveries led to renewed interest in other missing persons cases from the war years. International human rights organizations called for more thorough investigations into the fate of journalists and other civilians who had disappeared during conflicts in Southeast Asia. Shaun Flynn's camera had not only solved the mystery of his own disappearance, but had also opened up new investigations into government activities that had been hidden for 4 decades. But the most important impact of Shaun's discovery was much more personal. For Shaun Flynn's family, the discovery of his camera and notebook provided the closure they had sought for 40 years. They finally knew exactly what had happened to Shaun, how he had spent his final months, and what he had been thinking about before his death. His notebook entries and photographed letters showed that even in captivity, Shaun had remained the thoughtful, courageous person his family remembered. The evidence also confirmed that Shaun had died doing work he believed was important, documenting the truth about war and trying to help other people tell their stories. Shaun's family worked with investigators to ensure that his final photographs and writings were preserved in historical archives where researchers could study them for years to come. They also established a foundation in Shaun's name to support journalists working in dangerous situations around the world. The foundation provides equipment, training, and emergency assistance to reporters who continue the kind of work that Shaun Flynn died doing. His camera had not only solved a 40-year mystery, but had also inspired new efforts to protect journalists, and Shaun's story would inspire one final, lasting change. Shaun Flynn's camera, buried for 40 years in the Cambodian jungle, had accomplished something remarkable. It had solved not just one missing person case, but dozens of them. It had provided historical evidence of activities that governments had kept secret for decades. Most importantly, it had given closure to families who had been searching for answers about their missing loved ones since the 1970s. The story of Shaun's discovery led to new international protocols for investigating missing journalists and other civilians from conflict zones. Organizations that search for missing persons began using techniques pioneered during the Shaun Flynn investigation to solve other cold cases from around the world. Shaun's determination to document the truth, even when he knew it would cost him his life, had created a legacy that continued to help people 4 decades after his death. His camera, damaged and buried, had finally delivered the story Shaun died trying to tell. In the end, Shaun Flynn had succeeded in his mission as a photojournalist. He had shown the world the truth, even if it took 40 years for anyone to see it. Sometimes the most important stories take decades to develop, but truth has a way of eventually coming to light. Shaun Flynn's story reminds us that some real unsolved mysteries take decades to solve, but the truth always finds a way to surface. This haunting disappearance story proves that even when someone has vanished without a trace, their legacy can still impact the world years later. His camera, buried in the Cambodia jungle for 40 years, became more than just evidence. It became a voice for countless missing persons who disappeared and never found their way home. What started as one Hollywood actor's mysterious disappearance became a key to solving multiple unsolved missing person cases, showing us that even in the darkest circumstances, truth and courage can illuminate the path forward for others.